Thank you for joining us today. My name is Keith Larson, and I'm the president of the Louisville Forum. The Forum typically meets on the second Wednesday of every month at Vincenzo's Restaurant in downtown Louisville, but these days we're meeting virtually. The Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group founded in 1984. We host debates and discussions of current and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the Louisville greater community. For more information on the forum, or if you have an interest in joining, please visit our website at louisvilleforum.org. Today's topic is the future of policing in Louisville, a discussion with LMPD Chief Erika Shields. As many of you probably know already, Chief Shields was appointed to lead LMPD by Mayor Greg Fisher following the recommendation of an 8-member committee. She was officially sworn in on January 19th. Before coming to Louisville, Chief Shields served as the Atlanta Chief of Police from 2016 through June 2020. Our discussion with Chief Shields today is going to be moderated by Phillip Bailey, national political correspondent with USA Today, and previously with the Courier Journal, Louisville Magazine, and Louisville Public Media. Thank you, Chief Shields and Mr. Bailey, for joining us today. At this point, we'll turn the floor over to Chief Shields and then to our moderator for follow-up questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Philip, for agreeing to moderate this. I know you're a much wanted man. And so thanks for carving time out for this. So my name is Erika Shields, and I'm jumping from Zoom to Zoom. So they got me in this closet right now. So I apologize if the acoustics are like in a closet, because I am. You know what, it's when I came in, I was very fortunate in that the city had just finished procuring a Hilliard Hines to do a top to bottom review of the police department. And the review had just completed right around the time I started. And I say this to say, because coming in as an outsider and having studied the landscape, I had a fairly good idea of what the issues were going to be that I was going to be facing. And the problem is I could come in as an outsider and immediately recognize that the diversity of the department is not where it needs to be. As someone who's policed, I can in fairly good measure tell you that there's a level of racial profiling that goes on in policing, that there's disproportionate traffic stops, what have you. The problem is there's a lot of people who don't agree with that. And so if I have to come in and spend months just convincing the community that doesn't subscribe to that this is really an issue within LMPD, that's lost time. The Hilliard Hines report had all of this documented, and that's huge for me, because then it wasn't just Erika Shields, the outsider, coming in and saying these are issues. I had it in black and white and data. Data is so critical in instances like this, that I could present the data and say, no, this is a problem. This is what we need to address if we're going to move the department forward. So I was very fortunate to have the timing I was very fortunate to have the timing of this report coincide with my starting date, because what the report does, it does lay out essentially a roadmap to move the department forward. I'll tell you the other thing that was also keyed up, and it started right around the time, it started several months before I came. They had subscribed to the business community in conjunction with City Hall, had paid for the group violence intervention, GVI program, through David Kennedy at John Jay College. And I had always read about this program and its successes with gun violence in Boston. I guess it would have been in the 90s. And it was one of the few programs that I felt actually provided supporting data to show that it could work. And so that the whole concept of it is that police are not going in to arrest, to intimidate. It's really, you're going in with caseworkers to try to identify what are some of the other underlying issues that are confronting the family that's experiencing violence and changing the trajectory. So we're getting rolling on that. So there's a good foundation for me to work with. More than anything, though, what I will say is, and I felt the same way about this in Atlanta, I'm very fortunate in Louisville. that the community cares, and not just the Black community, the Black, the white, the business, the academic, because when you're talking about driving these changes that are so dramatic and such a departure from traditional policing, and I'm going up against a culture of that's hardcore in policing, it's next to impossible to do if you don't have the support of the community. And at every bend here, I've felt that people want to help. And so I feel there's a huge room for opportunity, but a lot of work ahead of us, obviously. So again, thank you for allowing me to be here. I do appreciate it.
All right, all right. Well, Chief Erika Shields, thank you for that introduction. And again, thank you to the Louisville Forum for inviting me to moderate this conversation, which I really want, Chief, for us to have a conversation for the first 30 minutes, you know, just sort of have a regular folks talk as we integrate both what we talk about with questions from Louisville Forum members. And then the second half of this conversation will be mainly their questions with me asking some follow-up. So Chief, let me ask, as a Louisville native, look, I remember in the not too distant past, this being a city of 50 to 70 homicides, and that would create an uproar. There was a group called No Murders Metro that used to protest. We would have 70 plus murders. The first time we broke the all-time record was about 5 years ago with around 120 murders. Last year, it was 170 plus. We seem more like Baltimore than the Louisville that I grew up in. What, in your view, are the engines of this outbreak in violence?
Thank you. And I appreciate that question, because I was just saying, I was on a call prior to this with Kendall Boyd, the city's equity officer, who's been a huge help, that the homicide rate here is shocking. And yet the attention it's receiving and the concern is wholly disproportionate. It's, I wish we could take all of the energy that we're putting on other subjects and put it to the violence, because it is unacceptable. I think that there are several things. I think that coming in as an outsider, it was shocking to me to see how barren West Louisville is. It was, the 9th Street divide is not just a term. I would not have needed someone to tell me the term. I recognized it when I drove over it.
You mean barren economically?
Barren economically, yes,
Gotcha.
Thank you. Just where is the hope? I mean, where are the community centers? Where is businesses? Where is there a purpose? And it felt very, and I think so, if you take individuals who are already struggling and marginalized and further marginalize them without opportunity, it's a ripe environment for violence, regardless of race, part of the country, you name it. So I think there's clearly there's been a lack of true understanding of the level of economic opportunities that have to be developed in that part of the city. And I think there's a huge room for conversation with the business community there.
But do you think it's more just a room for conversation? But because you said you're an outsider, but those of us who've lived in Louisville all our lives, we've had those conversations several times over. Do you think that there are factors, or what the police department, I guess, is involved in that? I guess what I'm really asking, Chief, is, do you philosophically see police departments mainly as a preventative city agency, meaning cops can stop murders from happening, or as an investigative agency, meaning your main responsibility is to solve crimes and bring perpetrators to justice, or is it both?
So we're getting there. The problem is you have to understand, to answer your question, you have to acknowledge the economic platform, because the reality of it is that environment is allowing for the crime that we've got to deal with. So I think the economics of the area, coupled with the type of crime fighting that was going on at the time, and I don't think it was particularly focused. I don't think it was intelligence-led policing. I think it allowed some of the crime rates and some of the gangs and to really nurture and grow. Then you layer on top of that, in the middle of summer of 2019, there were several several high-profile traffic incidents, traffic stops that did not reflect well on an LMPD. And rather than saying, well, what's the root behavior? What are we doing? The solution was don't do traffic. This started, you can see, there is a chart that came out of the Criminal Justice Agency, and it's compelling. You can see from the summer of 2019, when officers stopped being proactive, their work went down, crime went up. It literally, it bifurcates just that sharp.
You see that as a Ferguson effect, perhaps, that police, and the Ferguson effect being that police officers, rank and file cops, complaining about all these protests, all these criticisms. I am less likely to be involved. How do you?
No, no. From what I'm told, that they were told by the people in charge of the department at the time, don't be proactive. We're getting bad PR, so don't be proactive. And you can see immediately as the proactive policing stopped, the crime soared. It levels out a little bit. Police start re-engaging at the beginning of 2020. The crime starts to go down. Breonna Taylor's goes public. Productivity ends. There's nothing proactive, and crime soars.
So it sounds like you believe that the police are a preventative force, and that the more they're engaged, the things that they do prevent homicides, not overarching issues like family structure, poverty, etc.
It's not mutually exclusive, but if police are not proactive, you are going to find the space we're in now where you're cleaning up homicides. You have to have a police department that is proactive, engaged. The issue is, how are they doing the job? What is proactive? What am I asking the officers to do? That is what has to be clear. But if a police department is exclusively reactive, that's what you have here. This department's reactive.
And the reason I asked that, Chief, is that we seem to be failing at both. I read in the Courier Journal, my old shop, my old colleagues there at the Courier Journal, that we solved about 50-something homicides out of the 170 plus murders from last year. Now, you weren't chief at that time, but since you've taken over, I believe the rate has actually gotten worse. We have about roughly 50 homicides so far, at least that's according to the April 11th LMPD report that I've obtained. And of those 50 homicides, only 14 cases have been solved. How do you explain that poor rate to residents west and to east?
Well, yeah, I tell you, it's straightforward. It's when you're in the environment we're in, and as broken as it is, and people aren't cooperating, people aren't talking to the police. They don't talk to the police if they're going. It's gotten into an environment where it's no, I'll fix the problem, and that has been across the board the issue. Now, I'm a huge believer in what you're subscribing to, and that is the clear up rates of homicides have to be solid, or you're going to have increased more homicides because
those people who have committed those crimes are still out there. Yeah.
But the reality of it is you're in a space now where several things are happening. You are having so many homicides that the caseloads that the investigators are working they're probably working about 35 to 40% more than they should be. And you can say, well, put more investigators over it. Well, that's great, except the department is short about 250 people, and we are cutting back every place that we can. So we just don't even have the luxury of polling people. I mean, we're at bare bones levels. So that's the first part. In a perfect world, we would have the required staffing to increase the number of investigators to work the cases. But then the other issue that you have is there is a lack of cooperation amongst the shooting victims, and that makes the job all that much harder.
I remember, Chief, writing about that in the past, right? Working with folks like Dr. Eddie Woods, who works with Operation Red Spot, and he's certainly been active at Risk Youth for a number of years. And what he and others often point to is, where does that come from, in your view, a distrust, dislike, hatred of police, or does that come from, look, I have to live in this community, so me testifying or me speaking up, I'm at risk, and there's really no witness, at least at the time I was covering this, no witness protection that can ensure that when I speak to police that I'm protected. Which one do you sort of fall on that?
It's interesting you said that, because it was not until I got to Louisville that I was confronted with multiple shooting victims, not homicide victims, but even just shooting victims that wanted witness protection. I had never heard of that at a local level. And we are encountering that at a rapid clip here, which I think makes your point that these folks feel as though if they cooperate on the shooting that they were not killed on, that they're certain to be killed. And it puts us in a difficult space because, as you know, local law enforcement doesn't operate witness protection programs. So
is that something that Louisville should think about offering? I know Council President David James has said that he's allotted some monies for that potentially. I know the state does, but it's very limited with the state. Basically puts you in another county for a few weeks during the trial. But is that something Louisville should consider? Because it's anytime I hear people say, or police departments say that, oh, people aren't cooperating with us. Well, there's a reason people aren't cooperating.
True.
Should we have a witness protection program in Louisville?
No, I don't espouse running a witness protection program. I think that, you know, to the extent of having funds available to relocate people to a hotel a couple of weeks, absolutely. And I think that's what you're going to see, the group violence intervention. That will be a component of the program. So I think that to that degree, yes. But when you start talking witness protection, I think it conjures up images of, you know, you have a different identity, there's security around you around the clock, and that's not feasible for a local government to sustain.
So is it the people's fault then, or is it something that LMPD needs to maybe have a better relationship with community? I mean, where does the answer to that go when we have no witness protection, but people aren't cooperating, and we have this alarming homicide rate?
I'm not one to just find fault. I think it's very easy to say, well, who's to blame? You know, no, this is the space we're in. And this goes back to the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
You have to change the environment. Is there any hope in West Louisville? Until that is addressed, we are going to have a cycle of violence. We have our job to do, and we will continue to do it and do it well. But you can't come at this as one thing is going to solve anything. It's a holistic effort, and it's going to take all different pieces of the operation to drive change here. What I have an obligation to do is to ensure that LMPD is executing at the highest level possible.
Right. We got a lot to get to here, so let me move on to another issue. The April 11th LMPD report, again, that I looked at also had this very shocking statistic. In terms of non-fatal shootings to date, Louisville at this time in 2019 had 46 non-fatal shootings. Last year it had 91. And so far this year, 180. That's a 291% increase. I'm not sure if my math could be off a little bit, but that's about 291% increase. Twofold question, I guess, here, Chief. What is LMPD doing to address guns on our streets? Mm-hmm. And what legislatively has the General Assembly done or not done that's made it harder for officers to get guns off the street?
So when I came in here, the strongest proactive piece of the police department is what's called CID. And they go out and they're the folks that are going out. They're not responsible for doing the 911 calls and can actually focus on getting guns off the street. That was the group that was responsible for the Breonna Taylor shooting. As a result, from the time, when the protests were going on, so you had probably 6 months of protests here, there's been no police enforcement. There's been no proactive policing, none. That unit also was told, stand down, understandably. They've been working 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., bankers' hours. You have had no proactive policing. So what I've done with that group is I've changed out people and I've changed the direction. And yeah, did I want to come in here and day one tell them, yeah, go out and get the guns off the street? I am a total illegal gun focused person. That is my mission. Because if you go after illegal guns, you will get the violent individuals and you'll get the people engaging in drug trade, not just the ones smoking some recreational weed. The problem is with the space that LMPD was in and the city was in, and it was a very precarious space, I couldn't come in and just say, go get them, boys. We couldn't afford for anything to go even remotely wrong. So it has taken time getting the right leadership in that CID, getting the right supervisors, and making sure they understand what intelligence-led policing is.
And I asked that question, Chief, because the rank and file officers I talked to don't mention the protest as much as they mention legislative changes, saying that what the General Assembly did effectively was say, with open carry that they can't pull over someone and say, oh, you have a gun that's unregistered, lock that person up and maybe get them off the streets for a period of time. I want to ask you a question I know that I've talked to Metro Council members about, particularly Councilman Anthony Pigiantini and Councilman DeCory Arthur. The Downtown Revitalization Committee, a panel of civic leaders, stakeholders, and elected officials, took a survey, I'm told, that shows the number one concern about downtown is public safety. Now, this is the engine, the economic engine of our city, and more than likely, some would argue the economic engine for the state. What's the plan to lower the crime numbers in downtown specifically, whether it's the perception, and also the perception, legitimate or not, that downtown is unsafe? How do we address those?
Right. And I think, there's been a lot of angst, especially as it is around Jefferson Square Park. I think that, clearly things were not traditional in the last year downtown for what people were accustomed to seeing there. For us, it's a matter of going in and being visible, ensuring that people can get to a building and to the, that they feel comfortable and that they can go into their workplace without being, shouted at or heckled, which I think is not, by and large, I think if you walk around now, what you're going to find more than anything is just the lack of businesses that are open. It doesn't have that thriving effect that was described to me prior to all of this. But I think in terms of just feeling safe, I don't think it's concerning on a whole. I think there's just not people here. So I'm hoping that with COVID lifting, we'll start to see more people coming back into the workplace.
Right.
That'll bring in an energy that's desperately needed.
Because there was always that debate with whether that was COVID-19 that did that or was that the protest. It sounds to me, Chief, like you're leaning more towards the protest and particularly the occupation of Jefferson Square Park.
No.
Keep people from downtown.
No. I think, every city, you go to any city, many of them feel similar to Louisville.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so I think it's very much COVID related.
I want to shift gears here to talk about obviously what's been on the country's mind, Breonna Taylor and the Defund the Police movement. Now, in May 2020, Chief Shields, 2 months after Breonna Taylor was killed, you said in a story in The Guardian while still chief in Atlanta, how whether cops or citizens, we've devalued life. You called George Floyd's death appalling, quote. What struck me was your answer, though, on how to improve police departments. You said, and I'm quoting you here, quote, the key is training and weeding out bad cops, especially when you see a pattern of bad behavior. I think it's getting engaged with people and getting feedback in real time. Let me ask you first and foremost, what is a bad cop from your standpoint? And what systems of accountability have you installed since you've been here to weed out bad cops in Louisville?
No, that's a really fair question. I think that in policing, we have a tendency to rationalize. So in other words, yeah, Phillip, he threw an extra punch, but Phillip's a good guy. He's not had a lot of complaints. He's going through some stress at home. All right, let's go easy on him. It's taking the lens away of we like Phillip and saying, Phillip, I really like you, but you can't do this. I can't have you out there behaving like this. And I think it's supervision. There's a tendency in law enforcement to not supervise and discipline it at a clip that we need to. Most of the time, there's a small number of officers, a small segment of officers who create issues and liability for a police department. And when they get in trouble, you can go back and look and be like, I wish we'd done something differently on this. And where is it difficult? Where I think one of the things that I'm running into here that is a challenge, which goes to your state legislature question, between the Bill of Rights and the collective bargaining with the union, it does afford unions more weight in terms of a police department's operations. And that does make it harder to push forward the disciplinary process.
But let me ask, I guess, I didn't really hear whether you've installed any sort of new policies in place that weed out bad cops.
Oh, yeah. So in other words, one of the things, like when I came in here, there's 70 internal affairs files backed up in the chief's desk. I'm not doing that. And several of them came to me with, exonerated. We're not, that right away I'm turning over and be like, no, we're sustaining. But more importantly, moving forward, it's ensuring that there is automation of the disciplinary files because they have to move at a faster clip. We owe it to the public. It's requiring the supervisors to weigh in on discipline because you have an obligation to supervise your person. And that's not been happening here. And then the other thing is creating a disciplinary matrix. It was astounding to me that LMPD doesn't have a disciplinary matrix. So in other words, how do we come up with a discipline? Oh, we have coffee, we like Phillip, and we decide we're going to go easy on you. No.
So would you say that, for example, the officers and the investigators who were leading the Breonna Taylor investigation, by your standard, before that shooting occurred, would they have been defined by you as bad cops?
Would the officers who were involved with it?
Hankinson, Mattingly, Cosgrove, and Joshua James, the head of the investigation, would you consider them to be bad cops before the shooting occurred?
I would honestly, I haven't looked at their disciplinary histories. That's for the stuff that, and Chief Gentry, God bless her, she tackled a lot of that stuff.
Right. Chief, let me ask, as far as the defund the police movement, I can see this going both ways. Given our explosion in homicides, I can see a more conservative-minded residents saying, what in the hell would we be wanting to take away money from the police department right now? But a lot of more left-leaning activists, are calling for straight abolition of the police. A lot of those activists say that, look, we've given LMPD more money and toys than any agency in our city for decades, and we're less safe. I want to ask, especially in the context of Dante Wright, who was shot and killed in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, are there some functions that other agencies, the health department, codes and regs should be handling rather than police? And should that money go to them to supplement and to do that, to give your officers maybe relief? Should officers be doing mental health inquests or parking traffic violations, et cetera?
No, I completely agree. So police didn't want to get into space and mental health. That started in the early 90s when everything else went away. And I can remember police, we didn't want to do crisis intervention training. We knew we weren't equipped to do it. But the biggest mental health facility in every city is the jail. That was something police were pushed into that area. And so what you're seeing now, and I fully support, is let's invest in those individuals from the moment a call, and this is what Louisville's trying to do with the deflection model is your call comes into 911 and you have people who are trained, just like there's specific dispatchers for fire related calls. You have specific dispatchers who can weed out and figure out, okay, this is the level of service this person needs as mental illness goes. And where possible, you triage and you don't even send out a cop. So, and in other instances, if you may send a cop with a caseworker. So it's imperative that there be investment in alternative services so police don't continually have to field calls that are largely non-enforcement.
Would you be in favor, Chief, of that money coming from the police department, or do you think it needs to come separately?
I think that both. So the LMPD is giving money to projects, both the deflection and also funding for caseworkers for group violence intervention. But I will tell you, I think that the financial lift is so heavy for every city. It's got to come from a federal level as well.
Chief, before we turn this over to audience questions and mix those in, I witnessed an April 9th video of police cornering a homicide suspect, DeAndre Smithers, at Park Hill, otherwise known to the city as Parkway Place, one of the last housing projects in Louisville. What was noticeable to me, Chief, was there was a sizable crowd of residents. I'm talking about dozens of people, in fact, who gathered to oversee and in some people's minds interfere with that police activity. What does that say about your department's relationship to community, especially, let me be poignant here, especially among the Black community, particularly its poor and working class residents? That video shows to me that you don't have, and your department doesn't have any trust with that community. Well,
I think that you're stating the obvious, right? That's what we have to do. It has to be rebuilt. It has to be developed. I think it's been broken for years, and it hit a tipping point with Breonna Taylor. So it'd be presumptuous to assume that things are favorable there. There's a huge amount of work to do. Right. Goes without saying.
Right. Let me turn over to some audience questions now, integrating them into the conversation. And this one, we're going to start off thorny. An audience member wants to know, when you were hired, Chief, they say that you made the comment that, quote, "what happened to Breonna Taylor doesn't happen to white people." That person says that that statement is not only factually incorrect, but it's also blatantly racist. Do you regret making that statement? And are you willing to walk that statement back today?
Absolutely not. Breonna, you don't see, we're not talking, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, go across the country, Eric Garner. This stuff doesn't happen to white people. It does not. Oh yeah, you might be able to find me a token incident, but on a whole, no. It is clearly, this is why we're having this conversation. This is why we're having this conversation. White people don't get shot stepping out of their cars with cell phones in their hands. That's just not the space that we're in. And if your mindset is stuck on that, you're not even on first plate. Get to talk to me when you get to the space that we're in. I've policed 25 years. 25 years. Mm-hmm. And I have an understanding of how we do things. And I can tell you there is disparate practices depending on the race of the person on the standing opposite of the cop. That's just a fact. Does that mean every cop's a racist? No, of course not. Does that mean that most cops are? No, of course not. But what it means is we employ human beings, and all of you have inherent biases. All of you have discriminatory thoughts. And the problem is, as an employer, I've got to weed these out and ensure that they don't influence how you do your job.
One thing I noticed, Chief, in these round of questions coming from the audience, that I had on my list was the FOP, which once again was at the center of controversy when it posted a Facebook post criticizing two of the mayor's appointees to the new civilian review panel. I believe their names are Stacia Ducey and Antonio Taylor. I guess, what is the solution to that? And do you think that the FOP, I can remember this coming and happening several times when I was covering city government. I'm not sure if you chimed in, but does the Louisville Police Union help or hurt mending these fences with community, in your view, and what can be done, to rein them in?
Well, obviously that hurt significantly, and I think it's unfortunate that they've chose to keep that person on as a PIO. They're obviously not equipped to do the job.
And by that you mean you're talking about former President David Muchler, who's now the spokesman for FOP.
Yes, thank you. I think that unions across America really have to. Some are more progressive than others, but really have to embrace doing things differently, because many times the steps that they're taking are providing no support to the officers. I mean, when you make a post like that, the officer then, who is just coming in to do the job, to go out and answer a 911 call alone, is now becoming the face, that they're the ones facing the anger, not you sitting in the FOP lodge. And so, and on top of that, it was wholly disrespectful to the CRB, the review.
Does FOP and Mr. Sergeant Muchler, former Sergeant Muchler, does the FOP owe those individuals in the community an apology?
They're not gonna. I think, yeah, of course they do. I think you owe an apology, but the bigger issue is, Phillip, that I would say is the apology, would we believe it? Would we believe it's sincere, or is it just to get the pressure off? You know what I'm saying? So that's where it's like, are you really looking at what you're doing and the damage that you're doing to the community at a time that it's critical we repair some of these things? Right.
Another audience question points out how you mentioned your support of GVI, the Group Violence Intervention. How is GVI figuring into LMPD's approach to ending the record bloodshed? Do you feel all city partners are pursuing GVI with the right level of urgency, considering the circumstances we find ourselves in?
So GVI has been, we came in, and yes, my deputy chief who came with me from Atlanta, Colonel Gwynn, has taken over running the LMPD portion of it, and it will get done, and it will get done well. It is imperative that GVI work, because what it allows for is it interrupts violence. And that goes to the whole point of, how are you getting ahead of and preventing violence? Where do I think that there's room for improvement? I think for it to be successful, when there are individuals who clearly are committing violence and shooting others, it is an issue for us when the courts are letting them right back out, and or these folks are going right back into the schools. So one of the things that we're working on, and I know that we're seeking to hire the city as a project manager, a new project manager, is we've got to see the engagement from the courts, because it's not a court-driven process, but when you have someone who is predisposed to violence and committed to retaliation, we need the courts to be engaged.
There's a bit of news coming out right now, actually, Chief Shields, Kim Porter, the 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center Police Department, who's at the center of the shooting of Dante Wright. She has been charged with second-degree manslaughter in the shooting death of Mr. Dante Wright. Let me ask you, do you agree with something like that, charging that officer, that former officer? And is it reasonable for officers to say that they can't tell the difference between a taser and a gun, particularly in that high intense moment?
So I don't know the particulars of like what second-degree manslaughter is, so I don't want to say it's the correct charge, but I will say she should absolutely be criminally charged. Whether it's murder, second-degree manslaughter, I don't know. I look at it this way. Yes, it may not have been intentional, but if your actions, whether you're a cop or your doctor, results in the death of someone, you have an obligation to take ownership of it. And clearly her actions resulted in his death. So I fully expected her to be charged. I don't see any way around that.
I want to get one more audience question before I return to a question about the protests and defund the police. An audience member, Chief, seems to be a bit upset with you about your comment about the difference between whites and blacks and how they're treated. The person says what Chief Shields said is just a flat out lie. This person says that white people have been killed by the police far more than African Americans. Facts matter. Do you have a response to that?
No, I think I've answered it. Thank you, though.
Chief Steve Conrad, Chief Shields, your predecessor had a traffic stop policy that stopped and searched vehicles in high crime areas. I know we talked about the West End where I live and many of my friends and family live. That was heavily scrutinized, that policy. What are your thoughts on that policy, and have you ended it, and why or why not?
So that goes back to when I was saying in the summer of 2019, they stopped doing traffic as opposed to just changing how they were doing traffic. What I will tell you, though, in the Hilliard-Heinz report, for those of you who've had a chance to read it, what is alarming in there is the traffic stops that are done in predominantly 95% white areas are disproportionately black motorists. That is the part that there's no two ways around it. You at some level have to take ownership that there is a racial profiling element. Now the cop might have thoughts all day long that somehow that car is tied to something, but the report puts it in black and white that it is just not, it doesn't add up. My position is you need to have probable cause, obviously, but more significantly, I want intelligence-led policing. I want us.
What does that mean, intelligence-led policing?
It means, okay, good.
You say that a lot. For pedestrians, what does that mean? Okay. Undercover officers pulling out
what it means is, this guy has committed multiple shootings and he's out. Because the reality of it is, for those of you that are not familiar with the judicial system, you need to know, you can be out for murder on bond. You'll be on bond for murder. You can be at multiple shootings and be out. There's issues. Never mind that the courts have been shut down for a year. So you're involved with multiple shootings. You're out on bond. I know that you're engaged in another shooting because you're involved in gang activity, drug activity, what have you. I look at your network of associates. Who are you running with? What shootings have they been involved with? When I take the shell casings from your shooting that's tied to you, what other shooting can I tie it to? I'm focused on the individuals who I know are tied to gun violence, period. And that is where your efforts are going, and to get the folks off the street with the illegal guns.
Right.
So that's a huge part of it, is giving the directive of, it's not throwing spaghetti on a wall and saying, I hope I get some. But from
how do you distinguish that then? How do we distinguish that? Like, how we distinguish that? For example, the Reverend Kevin Cosby a few years ago, president of Simmons College of Kentucky, one of the two HBCUs here in Kentucky, and the minister of the largest black church in Louisville, he was pulled over. And this is what I hear a lot from my neighbors. How is it, I hear this from Councilman Ja'Cory Arthur, who I spoke to the other day, and he says, look, residents in my district who are not fans of police brutality, they have protested against about the Breonna Taylor case, but how do you say to black residents who still want police to fight crime, black residents in the West End who are searched, who are law-abiding citizens, how do we distinguish between them and that high crime criminal element?
Well, I think it's what I'm describing to you is you need to know what you're looking for. And you also need to know You also need to have an understanding of the history of policing. And I don't say this lightly. You need to understand that when you go back to the civil rights, which is not long ago, right? It's not long ago. When I started working in Atlanta, there was still that the black officers were not fully allowed in the state's pension until 2004, I think. They were allowed to buy back in. So what you need to do, part of it for me is educating the officers on how we're perceived. The protesters in the 60s and the 50s, what did they see? They saw on the horses and handling the dogs. The horses, right. The people is the white officers. It was the white officers handling the German shepherds that are biting them. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because when a cop goes in a white neighborhood, by and large, just broadly speaking, not everywhere, of course, there's more of a receptive, supportive mindset. Well, if that cop goes in the black community and they see the young black male on the corner who looks away and in their mind makes a furtive movement, and therefore there's probable cause to a reasonable articulable suspicion to stop them, no. How about he just doesn't like you? He doesn't trust you. So it's educating the police that a behavior such as turning and walking away isn't of not of itself criminal. And so, I mean, there's so many things that go into this. But I think at the end of the day, it's real time, it's supervising and knowing what your people are doing, which to your point, you started with the traffic question, is one of the things that we're working on is I need real time information on the traffic stops that our employees are making. I don't want a quarterly report. I want to know at the end of the week that this employee has stopped X number of people. This is their gender. This is their race. I mean, this stuff is information is imperative.
Right. And Chief, you mentioned, in Atlanta, the experience of those black officers not being able to get into the pension system. Where do we stand? I know that we've had a lot of retirements. A lot of the faces that I was familiar with in LMPD have left the department. Where do we stand on three things? Number one, African-American officers in command, major or higher. How many African-American officers do we see in specialized units like narcotics, like homicide? I guess what I'm asking is, do we see ourselves in the police, or does that even matter? Because I think a lot of activists will say, piggybacking on your point, that even before civil rights, right, going back to the Civil War, that the origins of a lot of these police departments are in slave patrols themselves. Does the diversity of the police department matter to you? And where do we stand on African-American officers matriculating and I guess advancing through the department, or does that improve relationships at all? Or is it just simply, tokenism? It's
imperative. It's imperative. You don't become a leader in policing unless you have unlike types at the table. Diversity is imperative. And you don't start to foster those necessary conversations within a police department about race relations unless you have different types at the table. And if everyone at the table looks like me, it's not going to work. I knew coming in that the department was lagging. The department is 13% black. The city's 24% black. That's a huge gap. But what I wasn't prepared for is I plan to want to ensure that in the command level, the face of the department, that we had adequate representation of diversity. When you come up through the ranks, you test to make sergeant, you test to make lieutenant, but from above that point, you're appointed. I went to the lieutenant's list to see who's eligible to be appointed, because I know I was going to have vacancies that could represent something other than white America. And in that lieutenant's list, I had one person, one. This is a problem because you don't get to the rank of lieutenant until at least 8 years. Right.
That's also a problem because some of those black officers, they complain about sort of being squeezed in both positions, both from the community and from their fellow officers. So I do want to move on, Chief. There's a lot more to go to, and we only have about 15 minutes or so left. One thing, let me speak from the perspective of more conservative-minded folks, business owners, who point out that as early as Monday, we saw a protest for Dante right here in Louisville, where some streets were shut down. And those business folks are straight up asking, why in the world are we letting these protesters just simply shut down the streets? How do you balance that, not antagonizing that relationship and trying to mend those fences over the Breonna Taylor shooting, but also, ensuring that there is basic,
Agreed.
functioning of city government and basic functioning of the city. And I asked this on piggybacking on,
Yep.
do we think that Jefferson Square Park again is going to be this sort of permanent protest site? How are we enforcing the laws that we have?
So when I came in here, I would step back to do an assessment. And here's my thing, what I was seeing. I thought caravans meant just driving around. Then I started watching here, and caravans often morphed into hanging out of cars, waving guns, and screaming at people who were on the sidewalks. Okay, that's straight lawlessness. And I don't care whether you're black or white. People have a right to just be able to walk down the street. And the reality of it is when you have individuals who block intersections with vehicles, scream at people and wave guns, sooner or later, we're also going to have a retaliatory shooting. And then we're in a
is there going to be a zero tolerance policy?
No. Let me finish. We've been proactive and we have been very specific in just weeding out those individuals who are clearly violating the law. I'll tell you what happened Monday night. Someone should have gone to jail. They were running in the streets. They were throwing lawn furniture in the streets. I mean, it served no purpose other than just to show you're behind. The reality of it is the supervisors fail. They're reluctant to become engaged for fear of that they're going to come under criticism. That's one of the things that I am having to restore is confidence and trust in the department to police. But no, with the supervisory staff did not lead like they need to, and we are addressing that. But that goes to building confidence in folks that yes, you are expected to enforce the law. It's how you enforce the law.
Chief Shields, you resigned as the chief in Atlanta after the controversial shooting of Rashad Brooks. I want you to give you an opportunity, because everyone asked me about this and I never talked to you before. Can you set the record straight on why your resignation was necessary for that community to move forward? Were you asked to resign or was that voluntary?
No, I will tell you, it was not a result specifically of Rashad Brooks at all. I spent 25 years there, love that place. And no, there were other factors that were already in my mind and that I was considering. It was already in my mind prior to Rashad Brooks. And when that occurred, what I realized was if I stayed on at that point, it was going to be a distraction. And it was my sincere hope that the city and the police department could move forward. Gotcha. if I can't remove myself as a conversation piece.
Can you take us through how the Louisville gig happened for you? Did Mayor Greg Fisher's team approach you? Did you see this opening and apply? I mean, were you done with policing and they basically came to you and said, hey, give it one more shot? Or were you still, hey, I want to do this and I saw this opening and it's a challenge to say the least in Louisville? How did this happen?
So I knew that I wanted to still police. I love policing and I value the profession, but I also know we're failing miserably and we have to, as leaders, drive this change. And really, I wasn't even at the space of looking for a job yet, but I started reading up on Breonna Taylor and it was heartbreaking. But I also saw was there were dramatic similarities between what occurred to her and what I experienced in Atlanta in 2007. And what I knew was I knew how it was going to play out within the department.
Right.
I'd been through it. And I'd also been a part of a department that resisted the criticisms and changes that came our way. And I knew then that I had the understanding and the ability to help this department navigate out of it because of the past failings that I had gone through with my other agency.
Are you interested in being chief under the next mayor? Mayor Fisher's term, his final term is ending fairly soon. Do you want to be chief when the new mayor takes office?
Honestly, I am so focused right now on today and on getting the crime down. And I think if there's anything I've learned from, this will be the third mayor I've worked for, is it's imperative that you are aligned with the sitting mayor. And so for me right now, there's, like 6-8 candidates. By next year, there'll probably be 25 candidates.
Right.
That's a whole nother, that's other people's noise. I just want to get the shootings down and make Louisville as safe as possible.
Let me ask you a critical question here, Chief. LMPD, even under your leadership, was resistant to releasing public records until about 18 hours ago.
No.
In an email yesterday. Hold on, let me finish the question. You cited, in an email to staff, you cited multiple court rulings against police departments and other agencies for withholding those records. But if you're committed to transparency, why use that justification in the first place? Shouldn't these records simply be provided automatically to the public, to the media, especially internal investigations?
Yes, yes. Let me tell you something. I come from a department where we released everything. And I saw a mayor resist that. And I saw one of his PIOs go to get sentenced for a misdemeanor charge on it. I'm all about releasing stuff. I come in here, we don't release anything. So I had to navigate both the culture, the law department, and the union. But I'm not withholding stuff. I'm not withholding stuff. No. And that's why we listen. We have an obligation. If the file's closed, have at it. It's not my job to compromise the forward motion of the department for select individuals in their decision making. And listen, we're releasing stuff. It was merely a matter of getting everyone on the same page and understanding why we're doing it. It was odd for me to come in and find out that the law department for years.
So can you commit to that here? Can you commit to that when internal investigations are closed, whether the Courier Journal, WOKY, Wave 3, whether they ask for them or not, they'll be uploaded somewhere for the public to see how this officer was disciplined and the facts of that case?
I think what I would say is whenever anybody wants them, they're welcome to have them. I'm not going to say that I even have the capacity to upload them when I don't even have them electronically for myself right now. I mean, that's the honest answer. Gotcha.
Let me look from the perspective of law enforcement officers, their families, rank and file. What do you say to those officers and their families who see these protests, who see this drumbeat of criticism, who are the Blue Lives Matter folks, and say, you're not doing enough to back them up, right? A lot of them feel frustrated and abandoned by city leaders across this country, but particularly here in Louisville, a lot of them feel abandoned by this mayor and others. How do you respond to that?
You know what? I'm just coming in, and here's what I tell the cops. I'm a cop. I love being a cop. I believe in the profession. It's a wonderful profession. I will support you, but I will also hold you accountable. And we are in this together, but I need you to also understand there are some things that have to be done differently. And I think there's some things that I can say all day long, but people aren't going to subscribe to it until they see it over time in motion, action.
A few more audience questions I think are important. Chief, this audience member wants to know, are you aware that Louisville passed a no arrest ordinance for cannabis possession of an ounce or less? And is LMPD following that ordinance?
I would hope so. I mean, I have no desire to be locking folks up for recreational weed. I mean, I guess I would have to pull from the jail records to ensure it's not occurring, but I think that's pretty standard.
Should recreational weed be legal in Kentucky?
Oh, I'm not. That's not. You're the politician. I'm not. I'm just the.
No, I am definitely not. This goes back to the FOP contract issue. And Chief, if you had already answered this in some version, I apologize. But this audience member desperately wants to know, what does Chief Shields think needs to be changed specifically, precisely in the FOP contract, when a lot of those negotiations are behind the scenes, that will lead to positive change and allowing things to be done differently? I'm assuming this person wants to know basically what needs to be changed for you to weed out and fire bad police officers.
I think that the way the merit board is structured is a real problem. So if an employee gets a day or more of suspension, they go before a merit board that meets once a month. My understanding is each hearing might draw out a week. That to me is, you're defending anybody and everybody at that point. I think that there's a very real problem with how the disciplinary process is structured.
Well, Chief Erika Shields, as we get here in our final moments of this conversation, once again, let me thank you and thank the Louisville Forum for having this discussion. An hour is certainly not enough to talk to you about these wide-ranging issues, and thank you for your time here with the Louisville Forum.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks for handling this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you so much. We do have a few minutes left. Chief Shields, if you want to make any closing remarks, or Phil, if you have like one last burning question, or
don't tell him that.
I guess if there was one, last question, Chief, I guess I would, I want this to be open-ended for you.
Yeah.
You seem to at least be aware of the racial disparities in policing, aware of of the shootings and how they impact the African-American community in particular, you also seem to be aware that there are others out there, more right-leaning folks, who feel like police have been abandoned and are being basically betrayed by leaders. Is there any overlap? Because I think we suffer this in our politics too. Is there any overlap in which we can address violent crime, but also address police brutality? Do you see us being able to forge that? Or are there always going to be these two camps that are going to grow more and more vocal and make it impossible for anything to be accomplished?
I think there absolutely is overlap. And listen, you're going to have on everything those two camps that won't move, right? But that's a small segment. My focus is the folks that are here, okay? You may not agree with what I'm saying, but if you at least are listening, and the very fact that you're on here, you know, you're giving consideration to something that maybe you wouldn't otherwise. I think a lot of it, and this is what we're seeing, is just making folks understand how the other person feels and is experiencing. The reality of it is, if you're poor and if you're not Black, you don't have to, or even if you're just not Black, the reality of it is, if you work with individuals who are Black and affluent and talk to them, they're going to tell you. They go in a store and they get followed. We don't. All right. That's fundamental. They're going to tell you when they go to apply for a loan, they get scrutinized in a way we don't. They're going to tell you if they're a Black male.
That sounds like, Chief, that we should be changing who are, because one thing I think is different is that I'm African-American, you're a woman. Those are foundationally part of our identities, but you're a police chief, I'm a journalist. Yeah. I could not be a journalist one day. You could not be a police chief. It sounds like some of these problems are, why not simply get a whole new group of people to be police who have a different mentality?
But just the whole point, this isn't about police, because the reality of it is, where does each of you work? Do you work at a law department, a bank? Look around you. What's the diversity at your table? What efforts? Don't tell me there aren't qualified people. Create the opportunities. This is, give people a chance. Don't just promote someone because you golf together and you're comfortable with them. Don't eat with them because you're comfortable with them. The point of this is, it's human behaviors. I'm employing humans. You're employing humans. We have to, as human beings, open up our minds if we're going to problem solve this together. Right. So to me, it has nothing to do with policing. It's about getting the discussion out there of understanding where the other person is sitting and what they're experiencing it.
Well, Chief, thank you. And Keith, I'll turn it over to you, but thank you again to the Louisville Forum for having me.
Keith, let me get out of here.
Let my chief go.
Thank you all.
Thank you. So on behalf of the Louisville Forum, thank you both so much. This was such a great program, and that one that really needed to happen, and a discussion that our community really needed to have. So thank you so much. Before we go, I just want to announce that our next meeting will be held on Wednesday, May 12th. There will be a Zoom panel discussion. We're still putting together some speakers, but it will be on Louisville Metro's budget and how the city might spend the more than $430 million of federal stimulus funding that it may be receiving. So with that, we conclude our April program. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.